think I'll make a start. So, afternoon everyone. So, this is the human impacts on the biosphere unit, and just to clarify, this is a dual-coded unit. So, some of you are undergraduates on the BSc Bio version of the unit, and some of you are, the rest of you are postgraduates on the MSc ERT version of the unit. So there's no difference in the lecture content. So we've got, for these next 18 lectures over the next 6 weeks, it's the same. It's me predominantly lecturing to you. And then for the MSc students, for the second half of your course from weeks 7 to 12, you get an extra 12 hours of fun with me on more in-depth analysis of these topics. So, I'm lecturing for the majority of this course and coordinating units, and then Amanda and Cecilia are giving the rest of the content. So, what we're going to cover in this unit is looking at human impacts on the biosphere in 4 topic areas. So, we're going to first look at the environmental impacts of agriculture, and that's starting from tomorrow. So I'll give the next 4 lectures 2 to 5 on these various challenges that agricultural systems have given rise to biodiversity. Then Amanda will take over from lectures 6 to 9, and she's going to cover the impacts of air pollution, and specifically air pollution deriving from road transport and the biotic impacts that that has. And then we're going to look at an urbanisation topic, and this is also a big potential topic. So here we're going to look specifically at the impacts that urban areas have had on urban river water quality. And Cecilia's going to give 3 lectures on that, and then my colleague, former retired lecturer Keith White, is going to give a guest lecture on his work that he's been involved in over many decades with regard to the remediation of what used to be known as Manchester Docks, which is now Salford Quays, and the work he was involved in, instrumental to clean up that site. And then I'll be back in lecture 14 to give a topic on impacts of metal extraction and pollution from mining sites. And then in the lecture 18 I'll wrap up with an overview lecture to synthesise all these topics and kind of look at the bigger picture, what are the challenges and potential solutions that we're going to look at and face in the coming decades. Okay, so if we think about humankind impacts on our planet, I think it's impossible not to notice where we've had really marked impacts on our planet with regard to the resources that we've extracted and utilised, the waste we've disposed in our planet, and the emissions from industry. So much change of effects have we made on this planet that it's been argued that we may indeed be entering a new geological era, which has been coined the Anthropocene. Because these changes, so if we think about lots of the construction that has taken place over many hundreds of years, so certainly in the last few decades, large amounts of metal, of concrete, of materials that construct our cities, can construct our infrastructure, and over time are being laid down into the geological record. So much so that so much material is potentially being deposited that in many hundreds of thousands of years from now, potentially when we're extinct, and the way we're going, it won't be that long, someone else may still see evidence of our existence. So we will potentially be a semi-permanent mark on the geological record. Another example is a lot of radioactive waste that we're generating from nuclear power stations are being decommissioned and other uses of nuclear power. A lot of this radioactive material obviously lasts for an extremely long time. We don't really know what to do with it, so we're dumping it in deep geological disposals in the ground. And this material is going to be staying there for hundreds of thousands of years before it fully decays. So we really are making our mark on this planet that's going to be very long-standing. But we're also making our mark on the other organisms of life around us on this planet. And that's particularly what we're interested in this unit, not just the global effects on our planet as a whole, but specifically effects on ecosystems and the effects on the other biota that we share this planet with. And we've had substantial impacts on a variety of species on our planet. And there's many, many examples we could go into, but just to flag up the key topics. Of course, we've been involved in facilitating invasiveness of species, so alien invasive species, so organisms that are non-native to a particular location have been introduced into that location, either through permanent action, so the examples such as, say, the cane toad in Australia that was introduced as an attempt to try and solve another organism problem, but it didn't work. That toad became quite vociferous at predating on a range of other organisms and became quite a pest itself, or quite commonly or unwittingly introduce other organisms from one geographical location to the next. And if that organism is more adept at dominating in that ecosystem, it can start out-competing the native species that are in that location. And this has really been facilitated by our abilities now to travel quickly, faster all over the world. Our global trade, so shipping, for example, is a major driver of facilitating these invasive species. So a lot of when ballast water is taken up in ships, a lot of marine organisms are in that water, and then travel to another part of the globe, and that ballast water is discharged. Those organisms from a different location are being introduced into a new ecosystem, and some of those may thrive and out-compete. And likewise, our travel across the globe is also spreading pathogens, whether it be human pathogens, but also particularly pathogens of other animals or crops. And we see many examples of incidents of crop disease that's been quite quickly spread across the globe through our actions. We've also been responsible for substantial killing of other animals particularly through hunting. We've been responsible for the extinction or near extinction of a whole array of examples of animals through our actions. And of course that has other consequences on the balance of the different ecosystems that these animals are living in. We're not going to touch too much on climate change in this unit. There's other units that will look at this in a bit more detail. But of course, changes to our climate are often a direct or indirect consequence of many of our actions. And of course, the change in climate is also affecting the habitat of many animals and plants, as well as ourselves. And we're also altering habitats more substantially through land use change or through pollution. And there's many, many examples, and some of these we'll touch on, where alteration of habitat has been the main driver of species change, both change in diversity of species abundance in different ecosystems, but also change in the absolute numbers of different species. So clearly we've had major impacts on these on the life around us. So much so that it's been argued that we may be living now through another new mass extinction event. Mass extinction events are nothing new. There's been evidence of a number of past mass extinctions on the planet before we came along. And the last one was in the Cretaceous. So it's Cretaceous mass extinction about 65 or so million years ago. And from analysis of the fossil record, it's estimated that about 76% of the species on the planet at that time became extinct. What are we doing now? What's the kind of rates of extinction that we may be directly involved in? So some recent studies have looked at this in attempts to estimate values of mass extinction. This is data from this paper published a couple of years ago in Proceedings National Academy of Sciences, and I've put the link of this paper on Blackboard. It's worth having a look. And these authors estimate that the modern extinction rates that may or may not be directly attributable to our actions, but more than likely are, they've estimated in some cases at 85 times greater than the rates of extinction seen during the last Cretaceous mass extinction. Obviously, rates of extinction is the amount of extinction over the time period. Magnitude is the total amount of extinction over that set time period that is being analysed. Quite challenging to analyse these sorts of figures, though, of course, because we don't actually fully know how many species we share this planet with. We have estimates of how many different classes of plants and animals there are, but we don't fully know how many insects, how many plants, and of course that makes it impossible to fully know exactly how many animals are going extinct. It's a huge resource challenge to carefully characterise these details. So why are we having such substantial impacts on our environment? So we have needs and we have wants. So our needs are what we have in common with all organisms. We want to, we need to survive, so we want food, we want to utilise food resources around us to keep ourselves alive. We also want shelter, so we want to build houses, so we build towns and cities, making use of our resources around us. But we also are a species that, with evolved intelligence, we think, we've got abilities, not need to constantly work, we can have downtime, we can have leisure time, so we can do other things, we can have recreations and hobbies. So we have wants. Wants whereby they're not essential for our survival, but we enjoy doing them. So it might be a hobby whereby we're driving around on an expensive motorcycle at a weekend. But many of these wants and needs to enjoy good quality of life also utilise resources. So, and we're quite good at utilising our technology and our ability to extract resources from our planets to satisfy these needs and wants. So we have been increasingly voracious at utilising our planet's resources. But of course, we're growing, very rapidly growing in population as well. There's a lot of us now on this planet, and you know this, you've all seen these graphs, these sometimes so-called J-curve graphs, showing this rapid exponential increase in our population in the last few centuries, and certainly in the last few decades. And I must admit, I always find these figures quite alarming, even sort of looking in my own lifetime, in the last 40 years, a substantial increase in our population, 70% increase in people on our planet, which when you actually think about it, is still quite remarkable. And we're an increasing urban population, so more and more we're living in urban environments, in towns and in cities. And this little blob diagram attempts to illustrate this change in our living habits, moving from rural locations into urban locations. So in much of Western Europe, North America, parts of South America, we're predominantly living in towns and cities. So in the UK, about 90% of us are living in towns and cities. And if we look at some more populous countries like India and China, even though the majority are still living in rural locations, obviously with the size of the populations, there's still large numbers of people living in cities. And we recently passed the turning point whereby now we have more of our planet's human population living in urban areas than in rural areas. So it's about just over 50% now, and it's predicted by 2050 to reach about 60% of our global population in cities. And when we're densely populated in cities, that's a dense point source of pollution, of a requirement of resources. It exacerbates many of these human challenges that we generate onto the environment. We've also been increasingly voracious in our utilisation and extraction of resources from our planet. So these graphs are taken from this paper that came out last year in the journal Global Environmental Change, and it's also worth having a look. It's summarising some interesting sets of data. I'm not going to go through all of these, but if we look at this graph here on the top left, this is quantifying extraction of resources from our planet over the last century. So the green is the extraction of biomass. So this is basically the utilisation of plant material that we grow, either for food, for direct consumption, or feed, which we give for animals to feed on, which we then utilise. And there's been a steady growth of extraction of biomass, pretty much in line with population growth. The one that's just really striking is this grey area. This is the extraction of non-metallic minerals from the earth, and this really has rapidly grown, way over in line with population. So on a per capita basis, we're extracting more of these minerals from the planet than we were previously. And this is largely minerals like sand, like lime, like phosphate rock, and a whole range of other materials that go into the production of aggregates and concrete, largely for construction. And that's what you see here in this graph below. The proportion is now much greater for the use of these materials for construction, for building materials. And we're accumulating production of vast amounts of concrete. And we've generated on this planet more concrete in the last couple of decades than we did over the last century, which is also quite a remarkable fact. And as well as extracting resources, we're disposing of the waste from those resources. And these two panels on the right-hand side are showing the outputs of our processing. So our emissions, shown here in this orange panel, are also substantially exceeding. So we're both ravaging our planet's resources at a faster and faster rate, and we're also disposing waste materials at a faster and faster rate. So just to put some numbers on these, so it was estimated last year about 90 gigatons of resources were extracted from the planet, so it's 90 billion tonnes. And about a third of our planet we cultivate for these resources. But the key point to remember is, of course, these are finite in many cases, or very slow to renew. So if you think of the utilisation of wood from forests, some of those woodlands do take, in some cases, depending on the wood, quite substantial time to renew. But many of these resources, so going back to sand, which is needed in increasingly large quantities for, say, concrete production, that is a finite resource. You don't tend to think of sand as a finite resource, but it is, certainly the grade that we want for concrete. And increasingly there's illegal removal of sand, such as the demand. In fact, there's been instances of whole beaches have been removed virtually overnight, where there's been a demand for this material. And also, the more we're extracting these resources, the more energy is required to extract resources, the more greenhouse gas emissions we're generating. So it generates a bit of a vicious circle. And in addition, these resource extractions lead to pollution as well as land use change. So we're increasing our footprints on our planet, both in terms of agriculture, the holes we're generating in the ground in terms of extracting resources, and our increasing urban sprawls. And these changes are affecting the biodiversity around us, as we're either removing or severely damaging a variety of ecosystems or otherwise present at these locations. So let's just look at these in a little bit more detail, and of course we'll go over these in more detail in the next few weeks. But what types of stress specifically do these needs and wants cause? So we can refer to different types of stresses based on the different actions that we're mediating. So we have exploitative stress, and I'll define some of these with some examples in the next few slides. So this is the exploitation of some of these natural biotic resources. Eutrophic stress can be generated through human population growth, and we also can see eutrophic stress through agriculture. Agriculture and urbanisation can also generate disruptive stress, so this is particularly land use change and the stress that entails. Disruptive stress is also seen through industry, sort of development of industry, the extraction of resources, such as the land use change through mining, and then these processes also introduce what's known as a chemical industrial stress. So let's explain what I mean by some of those. So exploitative stress, this is where we potentially overexploit these resources that have a limited capacity to renew. And a classic example is overfishing, where many examples we have overfished fish stocks, and North Sea cod is a classic example, where it has obviously a limit of reproductive renewal, by which if we're excessively harvesting these fish from the sea at a rate that is faster than the ability of the fish to reproduce, we're going to, over time, lead to a population crash. And that's, as this graph shows here, is what we've been very close to seeing in recent years. So the red and blue lines indicate the landings and the total catch of the fish. The green bars indicate the spawning stock, which has been rapidly falling over time in recent decades. And while new fishing quotas have been introduced in recent years to try and alleviate this pressure, we're still at quite a dangerous trend, and some of you may have seen some news articles over the last few weeks where there's been suggestions that we may have to halt North Sea cod fishing completely. And there are many examples of really near the mark commercial fishing where we've really kind of reached the limits of where we can't fish over more, or where we are overfishing and we're at real damage of completely losing some of these fish stocks. And of course it's not just a concern for us in terms of whether we're going to get particular species of fish to eat, but of course the other organisms within those ecosystems that both need those fish as a food source themselves, or the other organisms lower down the food chain, which are disrupted, the proportions are disrupted when a particular animal that is a major component of that food chain is either completely removed or its population is substantially declined. Eutrophic stress. So this is nutrient inputs into the environment, whereby an excessive accumulation of that nutrient, so particularly here we're talking about nitrogenous nutrients, we also refer to eutrophic stress with regard to phosphate nutrients, will drive an excessive growth of photosynthetic organisms, particularly, that will exceed their growth rate, growing rapidly when there's a large input of those nutrients in the water source or soil environment where they're growing. So this drives over excessive plant and algal growth, which can be extremely damaging to an ecosystem. And of course, agriculture, large inputs of fertiliser and fertiliser runoff into waterways and into other terrestrial locations is the major driver of eutrophic stress. So I'm going to talk a bit more about this later this week. And urban environments are also a driver of eutrophic stress, and in this case it's human sewage, which is the source of the nutrients. And it's not something we often tend to think about or necessarily want to think about, but we can produce quite a lot of nitrogenous waste. So in a town of about 30,000 people, that's about 500 times 10 to the 6 milligrams of nitrogenous waste per day. So a lot of nitrogen which we are getting rid of. And of course our wastewater treatment systems will be treating the waste to remove the bulk of that nitrogen and phosphate from the from a water effluent to prevent it getting back into the freshwater system. But this does not always happen. The industry works to certain limits, and it's argued that maybe the amounts of N and P which they do let back into the water system is still more than it should be. But also commonly there's sewage discharges during an instance of storms, which do allow substantial amounts of nutrients still into water sources. And there's been a number of cases again in the media recently whereby water companies in the UK have been fined because they are allowing too higher concentrations of these nutrients into our water sources. And not only is it driving issues of algal blues, toxic algal blues, but other toxins are accumulating from this waste in water systems as well. And as I said, we are getting more urban, so this is increasing the density of these point sources of nutrients. So it's exacerbating the risk of this pollution source in these locations. So disruptive stresses, in this concept we're particularly talking about disruption to the native ecosystems through land use changes. And there are a number of interventions by ourselves which has led to substantial disruptive stresses. So agriculture is one of these. Over recent centuries we have, as our agriculture has developed and our agriculture has grown, land use change has been substantial. And this is just some data from the UK, or no, this is from Europe, looking at change over recent centuries, whereby you can see quite a substantial reduction both in forest and woodlands and in grasslands as that land has been taken over to cultivate crops and for grazing of animals. So quite a substantial change in land use due to agriculture over that time. And of course this is substantially disrupting the biodiversity in those native environments. And then furthermore, other pressures from agriculture, so risks of salinisation, changes to irrigation where water sources are pulled from one region to another to be put onto crops, chemical inputs from fertilisers and pesticides and insecticides are also adding to the burden on these organisms. And I'll cover these in a bit more depth in the first of agriculture topic lectures tomorrow. Similarly, urbanisation, as our towns and cities have grown, also take up land that's otherwise natural pristine land, countryside that has substantial biodiversity. And as our cities, like Manchester, has grown over recent centuries, we have lost a lot of these natural land types. So this is data showing that the growth of Manchester from quite a small town in the 1600s, as it's grown through the 19th century and 20th century to the city it is today. And we now have a land area that still has some rural pockets in it, so there is still, maybe surprisingly, about just under 40% of farmland within the greater Manchester area, but substantially less woodland than there was. And the predominance of this land area is infrastructure, so it's residential, it's industrial land, it's business land, as you would expect in most of our large urban environments. So there's a loss of this otherwise native grassland or woodland, and with that a substantial change to the biodiversity of that area. Urbanisation also has substantial impacts on waterways. There's increased incidence of flooding as rivers get canalised or even put underground. Already mentioned eutrophic stress. Other challenges of urban environments is changes to the microclimates. So you may have heard of the heat island effect. So as we're covering up a lot of our urban areas with concrete and asphalt, that's absorbing more heat. Also we've got less vegetation, and vegetation otherwise can reduce heat in the area by the the transpiration effect of plants allowing that heat to dissipate into the atmosphere. But when we have a much greater urban area with less vegetation, you generate these small microclimates. So it's typical that in an urban area you get a temperature gradient of sometimes 1-2 degrees hotter within a city than it is within the surrounding rural area, and this can have substantial implications to human health. And this change in land use is the greatest challenge to biodiversity. So, as well as purely removing habitats for much animal life, we're fragmenting habitats, and actually it's this fragmentation that's a major challenge. So we're fragmenting as cities kind of snake out, and obviously roads and railways and other infrastructure connecting our towns and cities are fragmenting areas of land. And this, for certain animal types, can be a major challenge. It's often restricting access to sources of food for many animals that may herd over larger distances, particularly for mating areas. This is impacting on reproduction of those animals. Different organisms respond differently to urbanisation. Of course, our towns and cities are not completely free of life. You know, we do see many plants and animals around us, but the diversity of life in an urban environment is very different than it is in a rural environment. So we tend to have a change in the types of animals that we have in these increasing urban environments. So some classes of animals can be considered as an urban avoider. They just are not able to survive in an urban environment. We have other classes of animals that we can think of as an urban adapter. So the fox, for example, it needs access to a rural area, such as to reproduce and maintain offspring, but then it can come into towns or cities, say, to scavenge for food. And then we have organisms that exploit these urban environments. So your city's pigeons, for example, which actually can perform a lot better in some cases than they can in the wild. They can scavenge for waste. They can utilise and roost in many of our tall buildings. But what you find then is that you're getting a homogenisation of the biota that are living in these urban environments. And then resource utilisation is another major disruptive stress. A lot of land use change has taken place through land being taken over for mining or for extraction of particular resources. So these are some data from a couple of maps of areas in South America. So we've got Peru here, we've got Brazil, and areas of forest loss that have taken place in recent years. And we've been increasingly thinking about forest loss to convert land for agriculture use, but also there's been substantial forest loss in the Amazon, as well as in parts of Peru and other countries for access to sites which are rich in minerals that can then be utilised as these extremely large mines to extract these ores or these non-mineral resources. So quite substantial areas of forest land have been lost for metal and non-metal ore extraction. And then finally we've got these other pollutant stresses, these chemical and industrial stresses, where we're exposing the environment to a variety of potentially toxic pollutants. So in the case of agriculture, increasingly as our agriculture become more intensive, we're inputting substantial quantities of chemicals onto our agricultural land, but that's also contaminating the broader environment. And I'm going to talk about this a lot more tomorrow, but in the case of pesticides, our production and our use of pesticides has grown enormously in the last few decades. And these pesticides, from a farmer's perspective, they do their job, but of course they have off-target effects. There's many examples whereby these pesticides are giving rise to toxicity to non-target insects and other non-target animals. There's risks that resistance is being developed in the insects or the plants or weeds that we want to target by these pesticides or insecticides, and that's giving rise to more problems. And it is a major environmental challenge in many cases. Likewise, in terms of metal resource extraction, through mine activities, we're mobilising metals, sometimes potentially toxic metals, at concentrations much higher than they normally would be able to be naturally mobilised if we hadn't extracted that ore ourselves. And these pollutants can also be very toxic and can contaminate terrestrial ecosystems and freshwater ecosystems. And I'll talk a lot more about this in the metal pollution lectures in a few weeks' time. And then air pollutants can also give rise to substantial stress. And in a city context, we're hearing more and more about the health risks of pollutants from transport. So, for example, nitrous oxide pollutants. And while regulations and changes to emission standards, etc., has made an impact, this is slightly outdated data now, but it's still showing the point that there's been reductions in these emissions over time, but still, nevertheless, there's still challenges that need to be overcome. So I just want to finish by just clarifying some definitions with regard to pollutants. So contamination, when we talk about contamination, we're referring to the elevation of a particular toxin at a higher concentration compared to its normal abundant concentration. And contamination can result in pollution. So we can for activities that lead to the increased concentration of that particular substance, such as through industrial activities. So this is pollution, this is emissions of substances through, I'm not quite sure exactly what industrial activity it is now, I've forgotten where I got this photo, but this is not pollution. This is still the mobilisation of materials into our atmosphere, but this is of course a natural event, this volcano eruption. So this is an increase in concentration of a particular substance in the environment, but it's not due to human activity. So pollution is the direct or indirect introduction of a substance into the environment as a result of human activity, where it's then liable to cause hazards to human health and or the broader ecosystem. So just to sort of highlight on some of these definitions, when we talk about pollutants, it doesn't just have to be a natural substance that we're polluting. It could be a synthetic substance that we have generated for industrial process ourselves. There's a pathway of contamination that can lead to the exposure of an organism, which may include ourselves, or of a structure or system, such as, say, a waterway. Some pollutants are more significant if the effect on a target organism is more substantial. So some pollutants are more significant pollutants than others because they're more toxic. And we're not just thinking about pollution harm to ourselves, we're also considering pollution to the broadest of ecological systems. And quantification of these pollutants is particularly important because this allows us then to introduce standards and allow us to say to a particular industry or a particular individual, you're polluting, you're going over this particular regulated standard. And we'll come back to standards in a number of these examples in subsequent lectures. So any anthropogenic induced change of these types can be defined as pollution. It's also important to consider some other properties of pollutants. So is it a long-term, low-dose pollutant that may give rise to toxicity over a long period of time. So a classic case here is mercury poisoning, and this is, most of you probably know, this is obviously the Mad Hatter from Alice in Wonderland, who the hatter industry was a risk of pollution from mercury, because the production of hats utilised mercury vapour to add the felt onto the hats. And there's a number of industries where mercury exposure was a big problem, but it's not an acute toxin, it's a chronic toxin. Over a long period of time, the mercury poisoning can manifest itself, and it's also an irreversible toxin, unfortunately. Whereas other toxins may be acute, very fast acting. So a slug pellet, for example, a high dose short-term exposure will give rise to mortality extremely quickly. And there are other properties that are important to be considered when we're evaluating the potential risks of a pollutant. So how persistent is that pollutant? How long will it survive in the environment? How far will it disperse, or will its pollution event able to be contained in a very small area at the point source, because it has very poor dispersal properties? Is it liable to undergo any chemical or biological reactions that will alter the properties of that pollutant, either make it more toxic or reduce, mitigate the toxicity? Is there a risk that that toxin will be able to accumulate into biological tissues? So is there potential bioaccumulation? Is there a potential that it could be taken up into the skin, or into plants, or into a food chain? And how easily can we control that pollutant? And then finally there's waste. Waste, of course, is a material or substance where we don't need it anymore. It's come to the end of its life, or it's waste material through a process that we don't need, and that is disposed of. And of course, waste can become a pollutant if it accumulates at high concentration in environments where we don't want it, and increasingly where we're realising that it can give rise to toxicity. And plastic waste is a classic example of this, where we're increasingly becoming aware that it's incredibly persistent, and also scientific evidence is increasingly indicating that it can give rise to toxicity, particularly when it breaks down into microparticles and nanoparticles, and can become increasingly bioaccumulated and increasing in its toxicity. And as we increase our scales of production, we tend to generate more waste in that process. And this is an example to illustrate that with regard to making bread. So if we compare the bread making process, say back in the 1750s, compared to the bread making process today, so back in the 1750s, we're talking small scale cottage industry, or baking that's done within someone's home, or within a bakery. So this was in a single location, so there's not very much transport. So you don't need packaging of flour, you don't need packaging of material, because your end product does not tend to be distributed over long distances. It's just bought and consumed locally. Whereby, if we compare a more industrial scale process today, or nearly today, there's much more transportation in the whole scale of the operation. That's obviously inputting energy and generating pollution. There's much more packaging involved. There's various processes that are generating waste and generating and requiring energy. So the whole scale of production, when it's at an industrial scale, and also is at a more global scale, is increasing waste and increasing pollution and increasing the energy input. Okay, so that is my introduction. So what we're going to do in this lecture, following on from this, is we're going to, as I say, look at these different aspects of human challenges through a range of case studies. So as I say, we're going to look at the impacts of agriculture, the impacts of urbanisation, air pollution and resource extraction, and look at examples of where these activities have substantially affected our ecosystems around us. And as we go through these examples, we'll touch on some of the methodologies and approaches to assess and study these challenges. So before you go, I just want to just touch on the assessment. So as I said at the start, this is a dual-coded unit, so there's some of you on the BIAL version of the unit, and the assessment for the two versions is different. So for you guys on BIAL 31551, you have a coursework report that's worth 30% of the course. So what we're asking you to do here is write a case study report on a topic area. And what we mean by a case study is to describe a particular environmental impact through the illustration of the example. So, for example, if you're going to write a report on the environmental impacts of radioactivity, I don't want you just to write sort of fundamental properties of radioactivity and how it could cause toxicity or how it could cause an environmental impact. I want you to illustrate that through a case study such as, say, the Chernobyl disaster or the Fukushima disaster. So that's what we mean by a case study. We want you to take some examples from the literature and use them as a means to illustrate the fundamental principles from which we can understand these environmental impacts. And there'll be a list of topic areas which you can select that will be made available hopefully tomorrow. They'll be on Blackboard. And that's for submission at the end of week 6. And then in addition, there's some multiple choice questions that will relate to each topic. These will become available at the end of each main topic. And then you've got 5 questions for each topic area, and then the answers will be released within a week, I think I said. That's worth 10%, and then the exam is worth 60%, so you've got an exam within the January exam window, and that's 2 essay questions, and you have a choice of 4 questions. For those of you on the ERT 62051 version of the unit, your assessment is a 50% coursework report. So this is a consultancy report we're going to get you to write. We're going to provide you with some data, some raw data, that relates to the quantification of pollution and regeneration over time at Salford Quays. And what you need to do is analyse that data and interpret that data and write a consultancy style report where you recommend responses based on that data. And then the other % of the marks is an exam within the January exam period, which is a short answer question that covers all of the course and you answer all of the questions. And all the details for all these sets of assessment are on the Blackboard pages. And if anything's unclear, you've got any questions, do feel free to ask me. So, I hope you enjoy the course, and as I say, we'll kick off the first set of lectures tomorrow, and I'm happy to answer. I know, it's all you, isn't it? Awesome.
That synchronized with the recording or not? Because you can capture that after, right? Yeah, no, it's just simultaneously. That goes into that.
Right, I think that's
yeah, the adapter, everything.
okay. Thank you.